Hi, Isabella.
Hi.
Let me introduce Isabella Tree, who's the author of 5 books. We'll be talking about her latest one, Wilding, The Return of Nature to a British Farm. Isabella and her husband, Charles Burrell, let nature take over their 3,500 acres of land in West Sussex after they realized it wasn't economically productive for arable or dairy farming. The book is a grand experiment of turning their farm into a wilderness, now home to many species of birds and butterflies. It's also become a tourism site where people camp and go on safaris. So Isabella, tell me, how are you doing in these strange times?
Well, they are strange times, aren't they? We've just been receiving our first visitors. Our ecotourism business has been closed for pretty much, since, beginning of April when lockdown happened in earnest. And then 3 or 4 weeks ago, we began to open up visitors. People were allowed to visit areas of nature again, be able to drive into the countryside. And so we've been overwhelmed with people. I think there's just this urgent, sorry, telephone, there's just this kind of urgency of wanting to connect with nature again, I think. And it's not just us, but all the nature reserves in Britain are finding, 4 or 5 times as many people coming to visit. So it's been a little bit overwhelming, people parking all over the lanes and up people's drives, and local villagers getting a bit pissed off. But it's also been an amazing, the feedback we get from people just being out there in nature again has been incredible.
So what's your idea of happiness?
Happiness?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Someone really wants to get hold of you.
I might just take the phone off like that. Happiness, gosh. Do you know, this may sound really bizarre, and I don't know if you have felt a kind of inkling of this, but despite all the angst out there that's been going on, the global state of affairs, COVID and the environment, when we were actually in lockdown, and I was lucky enough to be in lockdown with my husband, my children, and a couple of their friends, my aunt who lives next door and her son, and suddenly everything was quiet, and I think we're going to look back on this time as one of the happiest. We're lucky enough to be able to walk out of our door into beautiful countryside. We were hearing birds singing without the planes flying overhead, without the sound of traffic, and just that sense of nothing urgent to do, no meetings, nowhere to travel to. Time was suspended, and it made us focus, I think, on us and, draw in the winds a bit. And that was, those first few weeks actually were very, very happy.
Where would you most like to live?
Oh, I mean, at the moment, right here. And that's what's been so bizarre, because I think, if you'd asked me any other stage of my life, I would have said Nepal, Peru, Africa. It would have been any of the places that I've traveled to and loved, and my endless restlessness, would have been taking me to far horizons. And it's only now that, we've brought the wilderness to our backyard that I feel really happy to be where I am. It just feels like we're in the right place suddenly.
Did you always know you were going to be a writer?
I sort of assumed that everyone wanted to write. When I was a child, I thought that this was normal. Everyone wanted to be a writer. But, I was always writing from the age of 7 or 8. I was writing plays, where I was always the heroine, and, I would have, people, playing parts that I could manipulate and to make me look fantastic. I always wanted to write, and I've always written diaries and articles. I was writing articles, trying to get them published when I was about 13. And it was only really, I think, when I left university and I worked for a little bit for a consultancy, and my boss was absolutely wonderful. And he said, "You've got to write." Sorry.
I find that interesting because you've written nonfiction mostly, as far as I am aware, but you say that you started out writing fiction and plays.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably as a child, one doesn't write nonfiction. I think you start off with fiction. That's how the imagination works. And I think in a way, it's what I'm writing now is definitely nonfiction, but in a sense, travel writing, which is what I've done for a lot of my life, there's elements of that which are very close to fiction. I'm not saying that you're making things up, but you're trying to regurgitate conversations, and you have to paraphrase and dialogue, and sometimes you have to play with chronology so it makes sense for a reader. So there's a lot more creativity in things like a biography, for example, or which was my first book, or travel writing, than you might think. I always try and temper that, by allowing as many people to read the work who are experts on it, or who are the people I've interviewed, just to see that they're okay with the dialogue, that I haven't gone off track and invented things, put things in their mouth that they wouldn't be happy with. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of novelists too who are fantastic travel writers. I think of Colin Thubron, who quite often writes a novel and then a travel book. I think they play together quite well.
Were you always interested in wildlife? Because you wrote the biography of John Gould, and then you did a couple of travel books, and then you wrote about a cultural practice of the Living Goddesses in Nepal, and now you've come back to nature. So nature almost seems to bookend your series of books so far.
Yes, I think I've always been interested in nature. I grew up, as lucky to grow up in a sort of generation where, I had a sort of very feral upbringing. And I think my parents belonged to the sort of benign neglect school of bringing up children. We would be running around in the countryside all day, and we just have to be back at home for supper. So, nature has always been very close to my heart. And when I started out as a journalist, I was doing very much environmental articles. And that kind of fed into my first book, which is a biography of the Birdman, of this amazing Victorian ornithologist. I was a classicist by education, so I did Latin and ancient Greek. So I've really come to the sort of science sideways. But certainly in my travel writing, there's always a strong ecological or environmental element, because that's really what interests me. And I think that also feeds into history and to culture very much. And even though I think The Living Goddess, perhaps on the surface of it, is perhaps a bit of a departure, it's very much about almost an anthropological theme, there's still deep-rooted kind of connections with nature. The Living Goddess herself embodies Mother Earth in some respects. And the closeness of that Buddhist connection with nature is very, very strong throughout the Kathmandu Valley. I remember talking to a farmer who was trying to explain to me the taboo of ploughing that they have in the valley. And he said it's like scratching your nails down your mother's face. It's that visceral, that feeling that your ploughing is wrong. And it's resonated with me so much now that we're looking at what's happening to our planet now. And the plough is probably the worst invention man ever came up with. And they instinctively knew it, and in the Buddhist tradition in Kathmandu.
you get the idea of what to do with your land? I mean, tell us a bit about your project.
Well, my husband Charlie inherited this estate from his grandparents in the 1980s, and it's a relatively large estate by sort of lowland British terms. It's 3,500 acres, as you said. It was intensive arable and dairy. When we took it over, we were in our early 20s, and it was already losing money as a farming business. My husband, had been brought up to just understand that he was going to take on the family tradition of farming this land. He'd been to agricultural college, so he came at it with very fresh eyes, with ambition and energy. And he felt that, even though it was losing money, he, with all the new technologies and all the sort of, he was a child of the Green Revolution, a misnomer if ever there was one, but he felt that he could take it on and make a go of it. And for 17 years, we did what every good farmer is supposed to do. We amalgamated dairies, we made efficiencies, we invested in infrastructure, we tried new varieties of crops, we diversified, we tried to make Charlie Burrell's Castle Dairy ice cream that was about to go national, but it was blown out of the water by Haagen-Dazs, who came on with this super sexy billion-dollar campaign and destroyed so many ice cream businesses in Europe. Of course, we were pouring more and more chemicals onto the land. But what we hadn't really realized was that our soil is incredibly heavy clay. We sit on 320 meters of clay. And so in a wet winter, and our winters are often very, very wet, you can't get heavy machinery onto the land at all, sometimes for 6 months. That means you can't do any maintenance, you can't work on your drains, you can't clear your ditches, you can't sow spring crops. So effectively, you're out of action for 6 months, which means you just can't compete with lovely soils, with farms on better soil than us. And it took us 17 years to realize that whatever we did, whatever investments we made, whatever efficiencies we made, we could never, ever compete. And so in 1999, Charlie, my husband, made this big decision to give up farming. And I think it was a big decision. It was a brave decision because it really literally went against the grain. I mean, this was in his family's DNA. It's in our cultural DNA. We're still living in that backwash from the Second World War, where Britain almost starved, and where you grow up in this idea of maximum production at all costs. Doesn't matter what your land is suitable for, you've got to grow food on it. And we know that growing food is essentially not the problem. We're already globally growing enough food for 10.5 billion people, and we're 7.5 billion now. We waste 40% of our food. So it's not really a question of every scrap of land being used for farming. I mean, much of it needs to be, but we still have space, or could have space, for nature. And that's when I think, we felt, well, let's do something that works with the land rather than battling against it all the time. And let's do something exciting with it. Let's see if we can rewild it. And by rewilding, it really means putting in the drivers that are going to kickstart natural processes again. The kind of things that it's almost like pulling a glider up into the sky so it can fly again. Getting nature back, getting it dynamic and functioning. And one of the ways to do that is to restore natural dynamic water systems again, allow our river to flood back onto the floodplain, restore old ponds, smash up your drains, allow the land to wet up where it wants to be wet. And also introduce these megafauna, the big free roaming animals, the kind of animals that might have been here in the past. And their disturbance, the way they trample the land, the way they rootle, the way they browse and graze, everything they do, the dung, the urine, everything disturbs things and generates this kind of mosaic of dynamic habitats. And then as human beings...
How did this understanding come to you that you'd have to do this, like bring in these big mammals to dig up the place and to fertilize the land?
Well, it really all stems from this amazing Dutch ecologist called Frans Vera. And his book, Grazing Ecology and Forest History, was published in 2000, which was the year that we had our sale of all our farming equipment, and we sold our dairy cows, and we sold our milk quota, and we cleared our debts. We were £1.5 million in debt by that stage. So we cleared our debts in 2000. And that's when we were kind of open suddenly, to new ideas. We'd been in this failing business for so long, we'd been really blinkered, just thinking about how we could survive to the next month, the next year. And that's not a good place to be when you need to be thinking objectively and imaginatively about the future. It's only when you draw a line underneath that failing business and allow yourself to move on in your head that you're suddenly open to ideas. And that's when we came across Frans Vera. And his ideas are really revolutionizing restoration and rewilding projects across the whole of Europe, because he's identified free roaming animals as drivers of systems, as the sort of the real keystone species that can get things working again. So we thought, well, conventional conservation, which is all about human management and intensive, costly human management, is obviously failing. In Britain, we've got 60% biodiversity loss in the last few decades. So everything we're doing is still failing. We're still losing species all the time. So why not try something where it's nature doing everything? It's nature putting in the effort. It's nature being the managers. And you just sit back and see what happens. So it was a big experiment. It was a leap of faith.
So when you first started, was it controversial? Did other farmers, like your neighbors, for instance, say that you must be crazy to do what you're doing?
Yes, we got a very interesting mailbag in the first few years. I mean, I think a lot of it was, rewilding wasn't really known about. It's got a lot more traction now. And I think, without wishing to boast, I'm so sorry about this. It's always busy, sorry. And if I unplug my phone, and then it never seems to work when I plug it in again. So rewilding is now, I think people are more familiar with how it all works, but it's, when we first started doing it, I think one of the main problems is that it's quite an affront to kind of cultural sensibilities. We grow up with an aesthetic, with an idea of how our countryside should look, and it's usually as the countryside when we were children. And particularly in Britain, it's very managed, it's very neat, it's linear edges. If you're lucky enough to have a scrap of ancient woodland, it's a little island in a field of arable. Your rivers are canalized and controlled. Your hedges are straight and they're clipped to within an inch of their life. Always the berries are clipped off them before winter so the birds don't have anything to eat. It's massively controlled and managed. And we've come to look at it and think it's beautiful. That's what our green and pleasant land should look like. And so if you're a neighbour of ours into the year 2000 and you're looking across your fence and you see the whole thing, these orderly fields turning into swathes of ragwort and creeping thistle and thorny scrub, you just think it's a mess. And we were called lazy, irresponsible, unpatriotic. That was another thing. Charlie's, letters to Charlie saying that his grandparents would be rolling in their graves, and they probably were. But we knew we were onto something exciting, because even that first summer, after we made the first transition and handed over the first tranche of land, 350 acres was the first patch that we did around the house. The most memorable thing, I remember walking out a summer's day and hearing insects, and I had no idea that as farmers we'd been missing that sound. Suddenly it was a surround sound, crickets, grasshoppers, bees, flies, incessant noise of insects that I remembered as a child, and I suddenly thought, that's what's been missing. And then, of course, when the insects came back, the birds came back, and then we introduced free roaming fallow deer, and suddenly it felt like we were in the middle of the Serengeti. You know, we were watching animals grazing across the plains, and psychologically it was just a mind shift. We suddenly thought, gosh, you know, we could have beautiful, exciting, vibrant nature right here, and we never knew it.
Wow. Just something that occurred to me. You talking about rewilding, but you've titled your book Wilding. Is there a conscious decision to say wilding rather than rewilding?
Yeah, I mean, it was slightly tongue-in-cheek, that, because, you know, rewilding, you know, it trips off the tongue, and, you know, it's used everywhere, and we kind of know what we mean by it. But in the early days, we got so much flack from so many people, and some of them were scientists who didn't like that little re word. They didn't like the prefix re, because they felt that it indicated, you know, that it meant that we were idealist conservationists. We wanted to go back to some primal Garden of Eden before human impact. You know, we were trying to bring back the aurochs and the tarpan and creatures that had gone extinct, and recreate something that is unrecreatable. And that is very much what rewilding is not about. Rewilding is kind of using, I think, the understanding of how nature functioned in the past, how natural processes happen, and the importance of all those animals that we hunted to extinction, what impact they would have had on biodiversity. But it's using that knowledge to create, in a sense, novel ecosystems. It's to use the tools at our disposal now to just help nature kickstart again and to function. You know, nature is always changing anyway. Ecosystems are never the same. You'll never have the same guild of species or the same conditions or the same weather or climate. Human beings have already changed so much anyway. But what you can do is just allow dynamic processes to happen again, and then you see biodiversity rocketing.
Did you worry in the beginning that this might not work and it could be a bad mistake?
We never worried that it mightn't work, because we already saw what was happening. It happened so fast, and you know, even you know, we, by about the 5th or 6th year into the project, we already had nightingales and turtle doves here on Nep, and those are 2 of the most endangered species in Britain. Now we're one of the biggest breeding hotspots for those species. In fact, turtle doves, which are likely to go extinct in the next 10 to 15 years in Britain. And when I grew up, when I was a child in the 1960s, we had 125,000 pairs of turtle doves. They're now down to just a few thousand because of habitat loss and because of pesticides, and just the chemical management of our lands. And so now we are probably the only place in Britain where turtle dove numbers are rising. So I think very, very early on, we knew that this system of, you know, putting drivers in place, allowing the free roaming animals to roam and disturb and just sit back and let them do as much as possible without managing, was working. But we were worried, I think, at several moments that it might be derailed, the project, because of the opposition to it. And I mean, one moment, we very early on, we suddenly got this outbreak of creeping thistle, which is a kind of pioneer species, and it spreads clonally. So it just literally spreads and spreads and spreads. And, you know, as a farmer, as soon as you see it, you're out there with the toppers and the herbicide as quick as you can say. But this just started taking over tens of acres, and then the next year it was hundreds of acres, and it was like the day of the Triffids. It just went on and on. And after about 3 years, you know, my husband said, look, you know, and the outrage from the local community and people trying to write to our MPs and the government to stop this project happening because of this sort of atrocity, Charlie said, I think we might have to get out there and manage it. We're going to have to change our ethos. And just when he was beginning to waver, we woke up one morning and we were seeing these painted lady butterflies streaming past our bedroom window, like tracer, about one a minute. And we couldn't understand what was going on. And we ran outside. And it just happened to be a boom year for painted lady butterflies. They'd migrated up from Morocco by the million to Britain. And their food plant is a creeping thistle. And they were laying their eggs on the creeping thistle. And that year, their caterpillars emerged, demolished the whole lot. And the next year, there was nothing. And in the meantime, during those 3 or 4 years where the creeping thistle had been, it had become a sanctuary for things like little common lizards, for small mammals, for insects, grasshoppers, and ants that created these anthills, very quickly because they weren't being kicked over by the horses or the cattle or the deer. And so you suddenly realize that this creeping thistle actually benefited momentarily a huge suite of species. And now it's gone. You can see where it was by all these anthills that it left behind. So we began to realize that was our first lesson in the boom and bust cycle of nature, that if something seems to be taking over, it's never going to be forever. Nature doesn't tolerate a monoculture for very long. It will disappear. Some pathogen, some virus, some pest will come in to take it out. And in the meantime, all sorts of other species might be benefiting. So we got very relaxed about it, and now we don't care. We just let nature gets on with it.
So did you, I know you mentioned that you knocked down your drains and let streams flood the banks and create wetlands, but is it really just so simple as letting the land go? Or did you have to selectively do something at specific points in time? Was that a planned, staged process?
Yeah, I mean, so that's sort of what I mean by kind of kick-starting the process, by pulling the plane up into the sky. If you just leave a piece of land, if you're in a temperate zone, Europe like we are, it will turn into thorny scrub. Eventually it will turn into trees. Eventually it will turn into closed canopy woodland, which is very undynamic, very species poor. What you need is that disturbance to interact with the trees. So you want trees coming back, of course, you want vegetation, but you want that complexity of structure. You want the messy margins, the mosaics, which is really rocket fuel for biodiversity. And so it's restoring natural water systems and introducing those free roaming animals after the vegetation has had a chance to establish. That is what creates that dynamic kind of kaleidoscope, as it were. So, you don't want a static game over, succession of vegetation, because that will be very poor, very unbiodiverse. You have to inject, you have to give nature a little bit of help to begin with. And then once it's off and functioning, you sit back.
So am I right in understanding from what you said that you didn't actually go out and plant trees?
No, I mean, that's the amazing thing. I have a bit of a bugbear about planting trees because nature has been regenerating trees without us, since the planet began. And we now think that the only way we can get trees back into a landscape is if we grow the saplings in nurseries, hugely expensive, hugely time consuming, extremely high cost in carbon. Transport, another carbon cost, these saplings to a site, usually protect them in plastic tubes attached to tannalized wooden stakes with plastic ties. Again, huge expense, high carbon, polluting. And none of these saplings have the mycorrhizal associates, those little fungal filaments that attach to the plant that allows them to take up nutrients that they naturally have in the wild. They're connected to the underground system, that amazing sort of keyboard of, you know, circuit of circuitry that connects them with other plants and nutrients. They don't have any of that. And we expect that to be as good as nature could do. And what we've seen at NEP is that trees will naturally come back. You know, our great iconic species is the English oak. And it's a light demanding species. It cannot regenerate in closed canopy, dense woodland conditions. And the agent of planting oaks is the jay. This beautiful bird can plant, one bird can plant 7,000 acorns in 4 weeks. And it plants them right next to thorny scrub because it knows that that will protect the sapling as it grows. It's how the jay remembers where it's planted that little acorn. And often it just uses the acorn. It in the spring, it will pull up the little sapling as it grows. It won't destroy it. It won't pull it up entirely. It just lifts it up so that its cotyledons are revealed above the earth. And that's what it feeds its chicks. And the oak has developed a system where it doesn't need the cotyledons. It's one of the few tree species which doesn't need cotyledons to feed on as it grows. It's almost developed those and given it to the jay in thanks for its kind of midwifery. And so there's this symbiotic process that is so sophisticated. And, you know, we now have, you know, hundreds and hundreds of oaks growing this way, just naturally without having done a thing.
Wow, that sounds fantastic. So what do you call your place now? Is it still a farm or do you call it something else?
We call it a rewilding project. So we've called it NEP Wildland. And we are ostensibly still farmers because you have all these free roaming animals out there. And we have, for example, Old English longhorn cattle. They're really doing the job of the ancient aurochs. This was the primeval ox that went extinct. We hunted it to extinction in Europe centuries and centuries ago. But the cow is its descendant. And so using an old breed that can survive out there all year round, it's doing pretty much the same functions as an ancient aurochs would have done. It's transporting seeds around the landscape. A cow can transport 230 different seed species in its hooves and its gut and its fur. It's a hugely dynamic animal. But obviously you don't want too many of them because otherwise you would get an overgrazed system, very much like our intensive farm systems. You don't want too few or you would get the whole place covered again in trees, and that again would be very undynamic. You want just enough to battle with the tree succession and with the vegetation to create that dynamic landscape. So we keep the animal numbers low. We don't have predators. We don't have wolves, bears, wolverine, lynx anymore in Britain. One day, maybe. But we have to be the predator. And so we keep those numbers low. So we sell every year 75 tons of beef and venison from the project. And, you know, that is sustainably sourced meat. So we do call ourselves farmers still, but that's very much a sort of second string, really. You know, our main aim is as being a nature restoration project. And that is just a way we can derive some income from what we do.
You researched getting European bison to your farm and it didn't quite work out, which is why you went with your old native breed of cattle, right?
No, a bison is a different creature. So the cow is directly descended from the aurochs, which we don't have anymore. We would love to have bison. And in fact, there's one area in Kent, which literally this week it was declared the British government has allowed them to introduce bison in 2 years' time. So we'll have bison in Britain for the first time in thousands of years, which will be absolutely incredible because, again, it's another species. It's got completely different ways of disturbing the land. it actually gets rid of trees. In Europe, it's called the chainsaw on legs. And that can be really important. It's a species which likes sandy heathland habitats. Heathland is incredibly rare. It's a hugely biodiverse habitat, but it's not a treed landscape. And we have to manually remove trees from heathland to stop these trees encroaching on it, in order to preserve that habitat. But bison naturally do that. In winter, they will chew the bark, they'll ring bark trees and get rid of them. So in a lot of rewilding projects in Europe, bison are being used to hold back the encroachment of trees from sensitive habitats.
Are you planning to get some too, now that they'll be in Kent?
We'd love some. We're jealous. We're jealous of Kent. We would absolutely love some. And I mean, you know, they just look amazing. We'd love to have another big mammal back in our landscape. Would be great.
What do your neighbors think of your project now that they've seen what can happen with land returned to nature?
It's very interesting. I think, you know, with time, I think people do change. The mindset begins to change, and you know, the fear factor falls away. No one's been attacked by an old English longhorn cow. No one's been attacked by a red deer. You know, your aesthetic begins to change. We had a letter of apology actually from a woman last year. It was really sweet. She said, "I'm so sorry. In the early days, I sent you a furious letter because I felt that what you were desecrating a beautiful piece of land." And she said, "But now I understand that Nep is still beautiful. It's just beautiful in a very different way." And I think, you know, that begins to happen. I think once the initial dramatic change is over and it's begun to be a little bit more stable, and also people have a chance to walk in it and enjoy it and hear the bird song and feel it for themselves, then that has a very profound change. And now, you know, we have, you know, so many people coming to visit, so many supporters. It's really beginning to change, I think, the way people are looking at their landscape. And I think particularly in the last couple of years, I don't know whether it's, you know, the Greta Thunberg effect or the plastics revolution or climate change or whatever, Extinction Rebellion. I think people are beginning to think really imaginatively about solutions now, and also yearning for change and feeling that our landscape is missing something really important. And I think that is, Nep has come of age. It's almost like it's of the moment, and it's the kind of message of hope that people are wanting to hear.
Did you always know you were going to write about it?
I always thought once we were a few years in, and it was very, very exciting. I knew it would make a good book. I was involved then with my book on the Living Goddess, which I thought was going to take 2 or 3 years, and in the end took 14. And actually, I have the Living Goddess to thank for that, because if it hadn't been for that book taking so long, I might have been tempted to start this one earlier, and we wouldn't have had the results to shout about that we do now. We have so much scientific evidence we've been monitoring from the moment we started the project, and now it's incontrovertible, the evidence. But also we'd have missed the timing, and I think it's, you know, as I say, I think it's just in the last couple of years. If it had been published 6 years ago, I don't think anyone would have heard of rewilding or cared. And now it's just hitting the sweet spot. It's hitting that button.
It's an ongoing project, and the land will continue to change, I would imagine. So how did you know when to end the book, or is there going to be a sequel?
Yeah, I mean, that's impossible. I mean, I was doing updates, you know, all the time as we went to press, and now I look at it and I go, oh no, you know, we've got 20 turtle doves, not 16, you know. So it's never going to end. I've just secured a commission from Picador again to write a book called The Return of the White Stork, which is about our white stork reintroduction project here. So we've been able to reintroduce white storks to Britain. This year, during lockdown, we had the first white storks to be born in the wild in Britain. since 1416. So over 600 years, this bird has been missing from Britain. So I'm going to write a book about that. But I think, maybe that will involve some of the sort of the more recent, things that have been going on here too.
Could you read us a bit from your book, please?
Yeah, sure. Well, this is really the end of the book. As we skirt the blackthorn thickets with an ear out for turtle doves, Charlie and I count mixed blessings. The joy at hearing the bird here and hearing it now is counterbalanced by the sands of time charging down to that single pinprick of loss. The turtle dove is a reminder that Nep is an island, only a tiny scrap of the carpet, powerless on its own to save a species on a trajectory to extinction. Even if the rich tapestry of a turtle's 3-brood summer were to be restored across the whole of England tomorrow, it is almost certainly too late for this lovely bird in this country. Our footsteps often feel heavy. Rewilding Nep has changed the way we look at the world, and much of it is depressing. When we go for a walk with friends elsewhere in the countryside, the same walks we used to enjoy without thinking in the past, chances are what we notice most is the silence and the stillness. As the landscape flashes by on a train or motorway, we now know what isn't there. Compared with Nep, most of Britain seems like a desert. It brings an aching sadness. And yet, that gentle touring, hugging at the heartstrings, is also a signal of repair, recovery, and rebirth, the rebraiding of unravelings. When the voice of the turtle dove is gone from our land in, who knows, another handful of summers, there is hope for the country it leaves behind, signs that the world is turning a corner. When it flies back to Africa for the last time, it will fly over a continent of Europe that is being recolonized by beavers, wolves, wolverines, jackals, and bears. It will trail in its wake ecological awakenings, a hunger for nature, and hope for a wilder world.
Can you show us the book, please? Yay! And that's the turtle dove.
That's the turtle dove, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Excellent. And let me see. Oh, yeah. So do you think more people will consider devoting part of their land to nature and wildlife now that, we hear about farmers in East Anglia talking about it, inspired by your book?
Yeah, it's had an amazing effect, and I think that the idea is really catching on. I think there's those East Anglian farmers, first of all, they're looking at doing regenerative agriculture on their land, but they're also looking at giving a fifth of their land into rewilding projects so that they can have real functioning nature running through that new regenerative agriculture that's not using the plough. Sorry. But there's estates that are 10,000 hectares, really big areas in the Midlands and north of England. There's some in Devon, in Cornwall. It really is kicking off. I think it's incredibly exciting, and we do have a government at the moment that seems to be well disposed towards thinking this way. In its 25-year environment plan, it mentioned Nep. It wanted to see more areas like Nep, wanted to see more connectivity between nature areas, things actually beginning to function at landscape scale again. So I think it's a very exciting time, and we might see our land healing and springing back to life.
One final question, since we are running out of time. How did you fund this project? Because it took so long to achieve results. You couldn't have had guests come over and stay and pay for their stay. It took a few years. So how did you manage to sustain? Yeah. So how did you sustain running the farm, or in whatever manner? How did you survive?
Yeah, I mean, it was key. We managed to get sort of funding from government. So it was an agri-environment scheme funding that eventually they realized that what we were doing was worth considering. And so without that, we wouldn't have had the money to create the deer fence, to ring fence up the area so that we could release these free roaming animals within it. So that was key. And we still get that agri-environment payment every year. It will be changed with Brexit. We hope that it will be replaced by something called the Environment Land Management Scheme. And this will be a game changer, I think, not just for rewilders, but also for farmers, because land managers will be paid for the first time for doing producing public goods, as it's called. So things like carbon sequestration, soil restoration, flood mitigation, water storage, purifying your water, biodiversity, places for human beings to enjoy, you know, for health and well-being. And that's going to be a complete game changer. You know, instead of just being paid to produce food, whatever the circumstance, whatever the pollution, this is going to make people think about the soil, about the land, about water again, and how to look after it responsibly. So we still hope we will get that, in effect, subsidy. But even if we don't, we now we're up and running. We have an ecotourism business, we're producing our meat, and we also now, all our agricultural buildings, we've converted into light office, light industrial use, office space, that kind of thing. So our buildings, which just were part of the farm infrastructure and hugely costly before, are now actually bringing in revenues. So there are definitely income streams that come online when you convert to a rewilding project, and that can be scaled down to any size of farm, I think. So I think, you know, we now are way more profitable. I think we're double the profitability of the average arable farm on most you know, projections. So for us, it's been you know, literally a lifesaver.
Thank you so much, Izzy. It was wonderful talking to you about your project. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Lovely to see you.